Welcome back, everybody. I'm Pascal Ota, an associate professor at Kyoto University in Japan, and my guests today are, on the one hand, the Irish author and activist Niamh Ni Bhriain, a research associate at the Transnational Institute in the Netherlands, and Fionn Wallace, a former parliamentary researcher at the EU Parliament. Both of you, welcome.
Thank you, Pascal.
Thanks for having us.
Well, thank you very much for coming online. And Niamh, despite practicing your name before, sorry for butchering it again. But
Don't worry.
I'm very glad to be talking to both of you because you're going to give us an update on Ireland. You told me that several political activities have been going on that basically undermine what is left of Irish neutrality and the Irish kind of pacifist foreign policy. Can we maybe start with Niamh? Can you tell us what's going on?
Yeah, so the government is planning to dismantle what we call the triple lock in the coming weeks and months, which will have very significant impact on how Ireland relates to the world. So maybe to explain what the triple lock is, because I'm not sure if your listeners will know, but so in Ireland we attribute the term triple lock to a piece of legislation that governs the deployment of Irish troops overseas. So for Irish troops to be sent overseas, for more than 12 troops to be sent overseas, there's kind of three levels of approval. So on one level, there must be approval from the cabinet. So that's the first. Then the second is that there must be a parliament resolution or a Dáil resolution. Our parliament is called the Dáil. So there must be a Dáil resolution. So that's the second. And then the third is that the mission that those troops are being sent on must have a United Nations mandate. So that's the third dimension of the lock. So three locks: the cabinet, the parliament, and then the United Nations mandate must be applied to the mission that they're going to. It's the United Nations dimension that the government finds intolerable, which at this particular moment is really, they've really got a brass neck at the moment, when the United Nations is under significant pressure. That our government has decided now is the time to revoke our legislative commitments to the United Nations. But maybe to just explain how the triple lock came about. So Ireland joined the United Nations in 1955. We started deploying peacekeeping troops in 1958. And then in 1960, the government of the day in 1960 brought in the Defence Amendment Act 1960. And that sets out very clearly that Ireland, in its relation to the world, imagine this is the post-World War II, Cold War period, when the United Nations has been set up to save future generations from the scourge of war. And Ireland, is telling the world, we will only send our troops overseas if they are part of the United Nations peacekeeping mission. We will not be part of a foreign force that's invading, an aggressive entry into anyone's country. We will only do so within these multilateral structures. And that's been in place since 1960, and Irish troops have only ever gone overseas with a United Nations mandated mission. The term triple lock came about in the context of the Nice Treaty, and then it was reaffirmed in the context of the Lisbon Treaty. And we can get into that maybe a bit more in the discussion. But to say now in 2026, the government is planning to remove the UN requirement and pave the way to deploy Irish troops on EU mandated missions, EU battle groups, on NATO-led missions, potentially, on virtually any mission. We now have Ireland as part of the Coalition of the Willing. Ireland participates in Keir Starmer and Macron's Coalition of the Willing. And if that coalition were to deploy troops to Ukraine, for example, Ireland, without a triple lock, could also deploy on a mission like that. So we're in completely uncharted territory in Ireland. We've never deployed our troops on any mission that's not with a UN mandate. And here we are now.
Why are we here? I mean, Irish neutrality was always kind of came out of this being squeezed between, swimming yourself free from a former colonizer from the British Empire in the 1920s and 30s. And then, at the same time, not really wanting to support the Germans once the war started. So Ireland remained neutral. They kept that posture. There was an up and down, but there were very important figures in your history in the 1960s again, like Mr. Eichen, Frank Eichen, who was like really a torchbearer for like Irish neutrality in the sense of we will use diplomacy at the UN, but we will not participate in foreign wars. And this has been weakened over time, especially when it comes to Shannon Airport and a couple of like basic principles. But the triple lock was very dear, as far as I can remember, to my Irish colleagues. Maybe Fionn, do you want to jump in and give us your analysis of how it's possible that the government is now thinking about taking away probably the most important of the three locks, because it's the one that makes sure that Ireland not on its own decides something, but that it multilateralizes the use of force?
Yeah, I mean, like the concept of Irish neutrality really goes back to Wolfe Tone, and then you have James Connolly around prior to the First World War, and then De Valera keeping us out of World War II, and then it goes on. But and Frank Aiken notably as well, a big proponent of diplomacy and using Ireland's neutrality as a force for good at the UN. But the successive governments since then, since basically we started to open up our economy to let Ireland be used as a kind of a platform into the to the EU for the US, and sort of invent experimental tax regimes and so on, and then kind of let the encroachment of FDI, foreign direct investment, of an American kind into Ireland in a very big way. This is, since then, successive governments have just chipped away at Irish neutrality. And as you noted, we had Shannon Airport being used as basically a forward military airbase for NATO and US military. And then we also, very striking was the role of Ireland in the genocide in Gaza. So contrary to kind of global perception, Ireland played a quite pernicious role in that. We allowed loads of US overflights of transition of weapons through our airspace, also through Shannon. And then we had these votes in the Dáil where Ireland was the site of issuing for Israeli war bonds, our central bank was, and twice there was opposition parties put a vote to stop this during a genocide, because we were effectively facilitating the financing of a genocide. Twice the government majority, just the plain majority, strong-armed this vote to make sure that it continued. So it's kind of a shameful, like in public, there's a kind of a, we recognize the state of Palestine and so on. There's a performative element, but then when it came to material measures, really we weren't doing anything at all. If anything, we're facilitating the genocide. And Francesca Albanese has, in her most recent report, has named Ireland as a country that should be considered complicit in genocide. But where we're at now is that they've even come up with a new concept that doesn't have any basis in international law. They call Ireland militarily neutral. I mean, it just doesn't. There was a case brought by Ed Horgan of Shannon Watch against the state back in 2000 or in 2004, but he didn't win the case. But the judge in that case found that his arguments around our neutral status were valid, in that there is no, like, and the judge admitted this, there is no concept laid out clearly in international law that applies directly to the type of neutrality that Ireland kind of promotes and works with. Basically, it means that we do everything up to joining NATO. But this is like kind of a political neutrality. The government kind of openly admits that America is our ally, that the EU is our ally, and so on, and that we provide support where we can. But now we really have a really sharp departure from that, in the sense that, if we wanted to send more than 12, we would have to go through the processes at the Dáil level, our government. But now it's up to 50. So without even a vote in the Dáil, we can send up to 50 troops into war fighting missions. And the legislation, the Defence Amendment Bill 2025, makes this explicitly clear. There's these like it's kind of like an omissions that leave open these loopholes. So it's very clear that it leaves open space to collaborate with NATO and also EU-led missions. It's stepping outside the UN structure, so that means it opens it up to illegal wars that we could take part in. And then if they go through the processes and they have the cabinet, the government cabinet agrees, and then they get the simple Dáil majority at the Dáil level, then it's a limitless number of Irish troops that could go on these missions. This is a huge departure from where we were.
You used a very important word. You said that parts of Ireland's official foreign policy posture was performative, and we've seen this in other we see this in other places too, in Switzerland, in Austria, where on the one hand you have the performance of like neutrality and the speech acts and so on, but in the background you have entirely different policies that are being worked on and actively pushed in white papers, in government reports, in government strategy papers, and so on. Niamh, can you maybe speak to that a bit? Like, how has this shadow agenda being pushed forward while the rhetoric, is still neatly in line with what it used to be in the 70s and 80s?
Yeah. And I mean, there's even different levels of the performance. So, for example, there's one performance that we'll get in Ireland, and then there's another performance in Brussels, and there's another one around the world. So, if the Irish state, sends representatives I lived in Mexico for a few years, if they send representatives to Mexico, I remember when I was there were some official visits. That we'll hear an awful lot about the Irish peace process and how important peace is, and how Ireland is about diplomacy and building peace and all of this. So that's kind of a performance that you'll get out around the world. This is how Ireland is speaking to the world. And that's what we see with Palestine as well, that, we have recognized the state of Palestine. Well, so have 100 and I can't even remember how many other states, but Ireland makes a big performative gesture of it. And then there'll be a performance in Brussels where we'll go to Brussels every time there's a European Council meeting, and we'll have, the Taoiseach, or Taoiseach is how we refer to the Prime Minister position. So we'll have him going to Brussels, and he'll have, Ireland is not shirking its or shying away from its responsibilities with our European partners, and there'll be a performance there that we're, one of these European states, we're joining the coalition of the willing. And then there'd be a performance here at home saying none of this is going to impact our neutrality, because the state, the government know that Irish, if they were actually honest, they know that if they came out and they said honestly to the people, we are going to dismantle the triple lock because we want Ireland to sign up to EU battle groups and participate in them. Now we're actually in this very precarious situation where we actually have Irish troops as part of EU battle groups, and we have the government saying in reports that we are ready to deploy. Those battle groups are operational now since 2025. Ireland participates in the training exercises because our law permits us to go overseas for training exercises, but we have this position now where we can't actually deploy because of the triple lock. So the government have, signed us up to the battle groups. We go to all the training exercises, but if tomorrow the European Union decide to deploy a battle group, we cannot deploy. And that's hugely embarrassing for the government. We cannot deploy because we have a triple lock, because we assume that a battle group, if, for example, Zelensky was to request a battle group to deploy into Ukraine, well, we assume that that would not have the United Nations mandate. At the moment, Ireland couldn't deploy. Instead of the government then being honest with us and saying, we want to remove the triple lock so we can send Irish people off to fight as part of EU battle groups or on NATO-led missions, and we were having a conversation about that, instead they're performing. So again, it's a performance. They have concocted a load of nonsense that the United Nations encroaches on Irish sovereignty and that we need to remove the triple lock. And these are direct quotes. We need to take our sovereignty back. So we're constantly being told by the government that we need to remove the triple lock, to take our sovereignty back, because the quotations usually include something like, we can't give dictators like China or Russia a hold over where we send our troops overseas. Our hands are bound by these dictators. That's the kind of language we're getting in from the government and from the media. So it's a performance again for the people, so that we do not realize that our neutrality is being torn to shreds right in front of our very eyes. And the government just on it's like they want to be the best student in the class. So it's like they want to go over to Brussels and say, now look, we've gone and we've done our homework, we've gotten rid of this triple lock. And when I spoke at the start, I mentioned Nice and Lisbon. I mean, that was hugely embarrassing for the government, that on 2 counts, the Irish people said no first to Nice, and then we said no to Lisbon. And the reason we did so on both counts was because we were fearful that in signing up to those treaties, Irish neutrality would be eroded and we would be forced into joining EU military structures. And so in the context of those referendums, the government gave reassurances that no, we have this thing called the triple lock. We can only deploy with a United Nations mandate, and that will guarantee that we're deploying in a neutral way. And now we have, we see that the people were right. We were right to be skeptical in Nice. We were right to be skeptical in Lisbon. Here we are 20 years later after, more than 20 years since Nice. Um, and this is exactly what we predicted would happen. And here we are with, the government now wanting to deploy to European Union military structures without actually going back and asking the people. So we get a lot of performative words and actions and straight up lies coming from the government, because they know that neutrality is extremely popular with the people. And if they were to come out and tell us that what they're doing is basically, dismantling the final shred of our neutrality, that there would be uproar.
Yeah, and it's just there is even research, a very good paper by a researcher called Philip Edius and one more co-author whose name I forgot, who actually, Ireland was one of the 3 case studies, and he calls this phenomenon Crypto-Atlanticism. People who hide their transatlantic affinities in neutral countries, Ireland, Austria, and he looked at Serbia, saying that the people that he interviewed, they all would like more integration into NATO and into the transatlantic alliance, but they are not able to say so because the local populations wouldn't like that very much. So what happens instead is that they start the preparations, right? You already prepare the integration into the battle groups, knowing very well that it's not going to fly together with the provisions that you have on the books, in your case, the triple lock. So what do? You work against the triple lock while already being prepared and create facts on the ground. Fionn, what's the state there? Do you think at some point, even if the triple lock is still in place, these deployments will go over and beyond what is allowed under the current legal framework?
Yeah, I think there's a lot already that has been kind of achieved on that level. I mean, in 1999, we joined NATO Partnership for Peace, and we actually sent a small contingent, but they were more like kind of officers who were working in a kind of advisory capacity in Afghanistan. When they came home, it was like noticed that we were actually over there because people had forgotten. I think we were there for about seven years or so. Then we have we joined PESCO, obviously, when that came about, and we were assured. I was working in the parliament at the time, and I remember the debate. It was like a 2-hour debate, and we just were told that we shouldn't have any concerns, that nothing would change, and This was just being responsible to our EU partners and allies. And then through that, we have like deployed. Even before then, we were already deploying to EU-led missions. One of the ones that's quite frightening in particular is Mali. There's been a lot of great research on Mali over the years. But I wrote an article last August, talking about how, it looks really like there was 2 elements that we took part in there, but in one of them, we were stationed with the Germans, doing reconnaissance. But it really does look like, I don't know if you remember the Bounty massacre in January 2021, France airstriked a wedding and killed around 26 people. They refused to admit that it was what it was. And eventually the UN did an investigation into it and found that, yes, it was a wedding, but it was monitored by drone for some time before they chose to strike it. But it looks like Ireland was helping out the German drone operators that were monitoring that. Now, there was a question put in by a Die Linke member in the German Bundestag, but the answer to the question about whether it was a German drone was basically classified. So we'll never know about whether we were complicit in, in peacekeeping, whether we were complicit in war crimes there. And this is like, all this stuff goes completely under the radar, and it's kind of happening all the time. As Niamh mentioned earlier, we're in battle groups training all the time, and we're actually taking troops out of UN peacekeeping missions to divert them to battle groups training. And, this is, we have a narrative coming from the government that we're being, the UN Security Council veto is prohibiting us from joining UN peacekeeping missions, that there's a deadlock at the UN Security Council where no new peacekeeping missions are being agreed because of, the new geopolitical reality or so on. But the reality is that there's 11 UN peacekeeping missions active right now, and we could join any one of them, but instead we're actually drawing down troops and putting them into the EU battle group situation. So they are really gearing up. And another really frightening development in Ireland is we're buying all sorts of weaponry recently. Like, we're sort of answering Trump has, and I don't want to focus on Trump, but it's hard not to, but the demands from the US and NATO to increase military spending. Ireland, we're starting from a very low base. We're one of the lowest spenders in Europe, but we are now investing billions more in weapons. And this is like a new phenomenon, but we're buying all sorts. We're buying anti-tank javelins, and we're buying not javelin, anti-tank weapons. We're buying all sorts of carriers, attack helicopters. Now there's fighter jets that are supposed to be stationed in Shannon Airport to protect our undersea cables that apparently Putin is never stops thinking about blowing up. With all these threats we get, and then all of a sudden the response is to basically militarize, like, in a really rapid way, but buying weapons that are not really suitable for like a neutral country. It's very, very worrying. Yeah.
It's highly worrying, and especially that we see the same trends everywhere. And this argument, of course, that must do our part, right? Ireland needs to take up the responsibility, cannot be a free rider. Switzerland cannot be a free rider. Need to spend enough, right, in order to defend against the threat, which is not a threat to us. It's like, okay, fine, but for the Irish case, like, the way that this is being sold to the public, or is just going around the public, in fact, Niamh, do you think that this drive is mainly motivated by aspirations toward NATO or aspirations toward the EU? Because it seems to me at the moment that the EU level is also preparing to, become more of an independent actor in this stupid politics of warfare and escalation.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, if you go back to the European White Paper on Defence Readiness, the 2030 paper that came out in March, I mean, that is an incredible piece of reading. It's 22 pages of it's basically a war plan. If you look at that, it's very clear. It says that, the US demands that Europe spend more on weapons. So there's that dimension to it. And then it says that NATO is at the cornerstone of European security. Now, we also have NATO written into various European Union documents. And we have, at the beginning of the Ukraine war in 2022, we have Ursula von der Leyen coming out and saying we are one union, one alliance, united in purpose. And she says that as she's standing next to Jens Stoltenberg, the former Secretary General. So it's almost indivisible, really. You can't, in many ways, you can't really separate out NATO and the EU. They're two sides of the same coin. And I think that what we've seen in the last few weeks, and in particular with Greenland, I would see it more. I mean, I would understand NATO to be a tool of US imperialism, and I would see the European Union to be part of that, your US imperialism. And I would see in the last few weeks, what we've seen is more a disciplining of the EU from the US. That we are being disciplined. We are being told to play our part, to do what needs to be done. We saw a fast deployment of troops to Greenland, then they were recalled again. And then we saw the European Union say, well, now we're going to spend more money on militarizing Greenland to please, to please Donald Trump and the demands that he has made. We're going to buy a military grade icebreaker that will, be able to operate in Greenland territory. So I would say it's the pressure that's bearing down in Ireland is coming certainly from Europe, but also from the US. I think there's two things at play. I think that nobody gets rich from neutrality. And as Fionn set out, there's an awful lot of money being made on, being spent on weapons. And so if, there's a lot of interest. We now have an arms lobby group based in Dublin, the Irish Defence and Security Association, and it counts among its members Lockheed Martin. And they've been lobbying the government for the last number of years. And so if we continue to be a neutral country that's, very lightly armed, then there's no money to be made for the arms lobby groups. There's no way that it would not make logical sense to be tapping into all of these military funds that have become available in Brussels as an EU member state if we were to continue our neutrality as it has been, which is very lightly armed and an army that serves more or less for peacekeeping missions. So there's a lot of pressure bearing down in Ireland, which, if you look at the seat that the arms lobbyists and the arms companies have at the table in the decision making of what goes on in Brussels, that is now trickling down to Ireland. So, we've seen arms lobbyists and arms companies being given a seat at the decision making table in Brussels for well over a decade at this stage. And now we kind of see the fruit of that is that all of the European member states are becoming more militarized, and Ireland is not outside of that trend. So I would say that, we can't kind of dismiss the role of the arms companies. And I would also say just, if there is a neutral state like Ireland on the edge of Europe, it makes the warmongers very uncomfortable because, they can no longer say we need to arm up and protect ourselves if there's a country in Europe that is not arming up and is actually doing fine, is not suffering, any threats or attacks or whatever. So this attack on neutrality, we've seen Finland and Sweden join NATO in the last number of years. We see now with Austria, there's moves towards further militarization with Switzerland, which you covered on your show a few weeks ago. So the pressure is bearing down. It's not coming from the people up. It's coming externally into Ireland. That we would change our foreign policy and our defence policy, and that neutrality would basically become a thing of the past. And just, I have this document here. As Fionn was talking about the Irish Army, the mission. So the Defence Forces mission this is just one line. Our mission is to provide the military capability to defend Ireland and assigned interests internationally. Now, who's assigning those interests internationally, and what are we, this is a particularly interesting line.
Can you repeat that? Assigned interests, not our interests, assigned interests.
Assigned interests internationally. That is our mission. So we are going to be assigned interests. They will come from the international sphere, and that we will defend those. Now, that's incredibly dangerous language to write into the mission of an army that's supposedly part of a neutral country. And we also have in our Vision 2030 for our army that we will be an agile, fit-for-purpose military force postured to defend our sovereignty, protect Irish citizens, and secure Ireland's interests. Now, this is a massive shift in language. Ireland's interests. What interests? What are we really talking about? So and it says very clearly, transforming our culture, modernizing our force, so it's capable to deter threats across multiple domain operational environments. Now, there's no threats to Ireland. We're not under attack. There's been no threat, But this is the shift in language going on at the Irish Defence Forces. And it's preparing us to participate in, the question kind of, where's the pressure bearing down, and is it the EU, is it NATO? I don't think you can disentangle them. And I think even though we're not full NATO members, we don't need to be, because we already have, we participate in NATO training. We have a partnership with NATO, as Fionn mentioned, the Partnership for Peace. We also have a strategic partnership that runs from 2024, 2028, and it looks specifically at this kind of cybersecurity and undersea cables and all of this stuff. So it's almost worse. If we were full members of NATO, there'd be some level of oversight. But because we're not, and we have agreements that most people don't even know about, there's an awful lot of stuff going on in the background that the vast majority, I would imagine that if you were to walk around Dublin today and say, do you know how embedded we are in NATO? I would say the vast majority of people don't know, because we have these kind of, an agreement here, an arrangement over here, and we get away with we get away with an awful lot by doing that.
Pascal, Fionn?
Can I come in on the NATO EU question?
Sure.
I mean, the 2026 defense strategy that the US just published, just about 2 weeks ago, it's very, very clear on all this. I mean, there's similar language, the language that Niamh just used, there's similar language to that in it. They're saying that they're going to push their allies around the world to meet the 5% military spending target. And as their, quote, allies do so, together with the United States, they will be able to field the forces required to deter or defeat potential adversaries in every key region of the world. And we've seen this, like at the moment, Niamh was on the radio yesterday debating John O'Brien, and he kept going on about, this is a brave new world, the Transatlantic Alliance is dead, NATO is dead, he said. But like, this is, the way I see it, is that the EU is doing precisely what the US and NATO want them to. And we've seen this again and again. So the first time you would have seen this was in the sort of Trump world or whatever, that's so rupturous from the past one, was in May 2017. Trump came to Brussels for the first time, meeting many EU leaders for the first time. And he said that it was about time that the EU started carrying the can for their own defense. And he wanted them, defense spending at the time was about 1% of GDP, and he wanted them to go to 2%. But at that time, all of a sudden, you've seen a kind of a freak out in the kind of establishment media and in the think tank kind of Brussels bubble publications and so on, about how the EU needed strategic autonomy and to go it alone, and we couldn't trust the US anymore. And at the time, you saw this debate kind of talk about how Brexit, Erdogan, Trump, Putin, this was like this kind of wake-up call for the EU to beef up and do its own defense. Then you had in December 2017, PESCO was basically agreed with this backdrop. It was like a record time agreement on something so significant at the EU level on defense, because there is a lot of disagreement in the EU on defense matters between especially Germany and France in particular. But then in December, you saw articles in Politico talking about how this was like fantastic, that there was a rapprochement between the NATO, US, and the EU, and that basically the EU seemed to need to do was like just become a more fully fledged defense union through the PESCO project. Trump comes back, right, and when in November, and the Republicans and his team, and the defense spending is up to 1.9% of GDP, almost exactly where he asked it to go. And then Mark Rutte comes to the European Parliament and he says, okay, let's go to 5%. And then the same narrative starts to be spread again. So Trump is unreliable. Look at how he is with Ukraine, screwing them over. He's too friendly with Putin, la, la, la. And then a couple of months later, we have the Rearm Europe package and then the Defense Readiness 2030 white paper. And these are plans to go to 5%. You know, you have 3.5% for actual weapons across the EU by 2030. And then you have 1.5% on sort of military mobility and so on. This is Trump's demand being put into practice. And I think what's going on now, it's kind of revived again. And now it's been used, this Trump is unreliable thing over Greenland. And, you know, they don't really talk about Venezuela so much, but Greenland in particular, it's been used again to kind of like speed up. We're not going fast enough to rearm. And this is very, very clear in the 2026 defense strategy. It says in black and white that they're going to push us as fast as they can and incentivize us it says, quote, incentivize and enable our allies to step up. This requires a change in tone and style from the past, unquote. I mean, they're just going to be really brutal and aggressive about it. But basically, the boss of NATO says jump, and the EU has said how high. But this narrative that Trump is unreliable is very suitable for like serving massive rearmament among US allies.
Yeah. This is one of the interpretations of what's currently going on in my little world, very closely connected to an analyst called Brian Beletic, who keeps making the point. Look, guys, it's continuity of agenda, division of labor. It's a different tone. It's the same goal at the end of the day, right? The integration and the making Europe usable to US war aims, and therefore like this militarization is needed. Now it also shows actually how differentiated this strategy is, and how it seems that Ireland is being targeted as something that needs to be brought in line. I mean, maybe not so much as a formal member, but one of Ireland's largest contributions to the EU, to hindering the EU's full militarization, is when the EU crafted its common foreign and security policy. Ireland insisted on inserting a clause, we call it today the Irish clause, that gives an opt-out to neutral states. Every state has to help protect the other states, and thanks to the Irish, it says within their constitutional constraints, right? Which basically means like, okay, even under the common foreign and security policy, each state still maintains the right to not participate militarily if push comes to shove. This is to me a very, very important contribution, and that was brought in somewhere in the 2000s, right? 7, 8, something around there. And this mindset today seems completely gone 20 years later. Niamh, Fionn, does one of you have an explanation of how it's possible that back then, 20 years ago, Ireland was actually, standing up for that right? And today the leadership seems to be overly keen and eager to be done with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the mutual defense clause that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And I mean, this actually came up at a meeting that I was participating in last night. And one of the people who was speaking there, he's basically dedicated his life work since the Single European Act in the 1980s to being, to critically kind of picking apart the different measures that come from these European treaties, Maastricht, Nice, Lisbon. And he's critical of how it doesn't go far enough. It should clearly spell out that this is for Ireland and that Ireland is neutral and that our neutrality will be protected, and that the opt-out is, it's watered down language, and it should have gone much further. And I suppose I would say that, even if we, nobody's maybe going to fly into Dublin and put a gun to Micheál Martin's head and say, send your troops overseas. But I don't think they would have to, because there's going to be enough pressure bearing down that I'm sure we would deploy anyways. And so even though there is this opt-out clause, I cannot imagine in a context where the government is getting rid of the triple lock they clearly don't want to opt out, because the triple lock provides us with a legislative opt out. We have legislative protection that we will only deploy on United Nations mandated missions. That is essentially an opt out, where we say we're not going to go on EU battle groups, we're not going to go on NATO-led missions. The government is deciding to remove that. And so I cannot imagine the opt-out clause doesn't make me feel, it doesn't instill much confidence in me, because I see what the government is doing, which is to remove our legislative opt-out, if we want to call the triple lock that, to pave the way for there to be essentially no impediment to deploying troops. So I think one thing is what the European Union, the Lisbon Treaty says in terms of mutual defence and deployment, and another is, and the opt-out that's built in, and then another is the pressure that's bearing down on states to be part of this, the language around the coalition of the willing, to be part of a, we have it's also got Britain in it, but the idea of the joint expeditionary force, all of these kind of different military configurations that Ireland could potentially participate in.
What will it take to get rid of the triple lock? I mean, this is national legislation. Can it be modified, changed by an act of parliament alone, or would it require a national referendum? Maybe Fionn.
There's going to be a vote in the national parliament. I mean, there's a case that there are people preparing a legal case if it does pass, but basically a simple Dáil majority in the Seanad are sort of the
upper house,
yeah, exactly, yeah. So the Seanad and the Dáil approval after a sort of a process of some amendments, but basically could be concluded in a matter of weeks. They've announced that they were moving it now. It's been coming quite a while. They first started talking about it in like 2022 or 3. But a simple Dáil majority, and as I was talking about before with the Israeli war bond votes, the government has the majority and they just whip everybody into shape, and they, even if there's some people maybe being a fall because it is a kind of a legacy of their party, they might just there is definitely a bit of disagreement inside the party about it, because there is pressure coming from below and it is their legacy. But even if there is some disagreement, we would kind of expect that they just hold their nose and do what they're told, because if you disobey the whip, that's how new parties are formed. So yeah.
So no referendum necessary. No,
there's a legal case. Sorry.
No.
Yeah, no, but there would be. There's two things. So basically, there could be a legal case brought that, and there is a valid case, a fairly valid case that it does deserve a referendum, because in the materials that were sent out in the Lisbon Treaty, it did sort of point to, if we said no, obviously the first 2 rounds, the Nice and Lisbon treaties, but in the materials that were sent out to the public, it did make it clear that if you voted yes, this would be in the context of the triple lock being protected. Apart from that, there's a mechanism in our constitution where if a law passes, if you get a majority in the Seanad, a third of the Dáil approval and the assent of the Irish president, then it could be kicked back to the people for a referendum. But if they get the simple majority in the Dáil, it's difficult to see how they could also swing, how it would be possible to kind of defeat them in the Seanad. So it's one to be worked at.
And maybe just to say, last year, in March last year, there was one of the opposition parties, the Soc Dems, Social Democrats, they brought a motion calling for a plebiscite, because our constitution allows for a plebiscite on questions of national interest. And they brought a motion which argued that there should be a plebiscite on this matter, and the government just voted against it. So they're very clear they don't want to ask the people, because they know they'll get the wrong answer. So it's they've already had the opportunity to have a plebiscite on this. They said no. that was last March when the bill came to cabinet first. And then we had the pre-legislative scrutiny during the summer. During the pre-legislative scrutiny, there were lots of testimony that said, questions were raised. Will this mean Ireland becomes involved in war fighting missions? Yes. Is there a potential that we will deploy on NATO missions? Yes. On EU battle groups? Yes. And even with that written into the pre-legislative scrutiny that's on the Parliament record, they still, continued with this legislation as it is. And so, the next steps are basically like Fionn laid out. And it's, Ireland takes the European Union presidency in July. And so the sense is that by the 1st of July, all, what Fionn set out with the two houses of Parliament, that they'll want to have already be done with that. And it will be already advanced to the stage where the president would be signing it into law. And we would be able to say, look, here in Ireland, we talk the talk and now we can walk the walk. We've gotten rid of the triple lock, and, we're fully able to deploy now on the EU, military missions and whatever.
It's just such a dirty game. It's such a dirty game to do that all under the guise of like, it will not touch our neutrality, everything will remain the same, while everything actually changes. And then all you need to do is to wait until something happens and you can give up this one too, just as Finland and Sweden did, right? When the first 3 Irish deployed soldiers die somewhere in, what do I know, Iraq, Syria, and then, we were attacked, Ireland under attack, 3 Irish heroes died. It's now time to finally get rid of it. I mean, something like that. Any final thoughts about this process? Fionn first and Niamh.
I just think it's so anti-democratic what they're up to.
Yeah.
Micheál Martin never stops. We have a sort of rotating leadership thing on at the moment, but so are, sometimes Taoiseach, and now Taoiseach. Actually, I'm confused. Now Taoiseach. Tweedledum and Tweedledee, but he never tires of talking about authoritarian states and so on, and we need to defend the forces of democracy from this evil threat. But this is authoritarian in its structure. I mean, Dr. Karen Devine has done years of research looking at opinion polls going back to like 1982 up to the present day. And she's found that consistently 4 out of 5 Irish people favor active neutrality, that this is really strongly connected to our identity as a people, and it's kind of connected to our, it's something deep in the Irish psyche, connected to anti-colonial struggle and so on, that we value independence and see our neutrality as a sort of a vehicle of that independence that's part of our identity. What the government has been doing over the past 2 years in particular is doing everything in their power through propaganda to disassociate the neutrality from the triple lock. Whereas Micheál Martin on the floor of the Dáil back in 2013 said that the triple lock is at the core of Irish neutrality. Now he stands up in the Dáil and says they have nothing to do with each other. So which is it, Micheál? Clearly they're lying. And they're just going to barrel on through this. And the propaganda attack, since it's kind of been announced early this year that they're going to move with it, the propaganda onslaught, and like every day there's an article or two talking about how we need to grow up, we need to be responsible because of the brave new world, things are changing and the triple lock must go, it's outdated, it's outmoded, ignoring the fact that, we've been through a Cold War, a Second World War, the so-called War on Terror. We've been through the whole lot of it, and we maintained neutrality through all that, but all of a sudden it's just everything is different now and it has to go. I think the last polling on it was that I think maybe 43% of the people want some change to the triple lock, but just like jettisoning it completely is not what needs to happen. If there's going to be some reform, some sensible reform, maybe, but like the UN aspect is deeply important, and it keeps us out of illegal wars. And I think if if that was made clear to the people, if they were straight up with the people, as Niamh said earlier, it would be an entirely different situation. This would not be happening. But they have to lie because it's disingenuous what they're up to, and they couldn't be straight with the people who are so opposed to losing our neutrality or joining NATO.
Crypto-Atlanticism and Niamh?
Yeah, I mean, it's just incredible. You know, we wake up every morning and check, has there been a new war started overnight? Like, you know, now it's Iran. Last week it was Greenland. You know, the few weeks before it was Venezuela. Um, and I suppose it's just incredible that in that context, instead of enhancing the safeguards that keep us out of war, our government is actively planning to remove them, to land us smack bang in the middle of the next war. And you know, it's something that if they manage to do it, and we do become embroiled in a war, and Ireland is exposed and is attacked. I mean, it would be the first time that we've ever, you know, deployed troops into a foreign war. You know, there has to be a serious political reckoning, because that's the reality that's facing us if the triple lock goes and we begin deployments into conflict zones. So it's a very dangerous moment. I have no faith at all in the government. I have an awful lot of faith in the Irish people. And I suppose what we've been doing, Fionn and myself, over the last year is trying to go out and have, you know, political education sessions, neutrality education sessions. We've been all over the country. Fionn's van is off the road and finished because we've been doing so much driving over the last year. You know, going around to different towns and villages, trying to get on local radio stations, uh, you know, trying to inform people that this is what's happening, and you know, organize some opposition to it. So let's see what comes in the next weeks and months. And yeah, ultimately, if the triple lock does go, then the organizing will become around stopping Irish deployments to war zones, which that's probably the reality we'll be facing if the triple lock goes. So it's not over yet. Even if they do manage to get rid of it, then we'll have the next struggle on our hands. So
No, it never is, and I congratulate you for that struggle and actually doing that. You know, it's not the case that that we're completely powerless. Not at all. We can talk about it. We can educate about it. We can write about it. We can oppose, and we can go to the streets and so on. And actually, that's what is necessary, because this is a political process. They try to masquerade it and say like it's inevitable. You know, the world imposes it on us. No, BS. It's not a BS. This is some weird willingness, and I don't quite understand it yet, but we're working on it, of like European elites rather trying to integrate amongst themselves and with the US, rather than actually caring for the nation state that they're elected to actually serve, you know, and something weird's going on. But we'll figure it out over time, and then we'll devise strategies against it. And I'm glad to know that you are working on that in Ireland. Fionn Wallace and Niamh Ni Bhriain, thank you for your time today.
thank you very much, Pascal.